Benning. I was apparently the first 40-year-old to complete basic training in Fort Benning's history, according to that. There's a reason why you do it when you're 20, right? So it was quite a challenge, but it was funny because I had to figure out how to deal with the military, and the military had to figure out how to deal with a 40-year-old private, which kept it pretty interesting. And so I wrote a book. It's called Victim of the Swamp, How the Deep State Destroyed the 40-Year-Old Private, right? And so I'll have all that information and such on my website. I wanted to go over a couple things, because unique as the story may be, with my enlistment at 40 and the experiences that I had in Afghanistan, and then a couple of years in combat zones, and after that as a contractor. Because when I came back from Afghanistan and with my reserve unit after my first deployment, I didn't have a job. I needed a job, so I took a job as a contractor for a company called Dynology. And Dynology was a very small, privately owned, family-owned company, and the owner of the company was General James Jones, who was the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, 4-star general, right? A very respected individual. I don't mean to, anything I say tonight is not meant to cast dispersion on the career of a 4-star general, but it is to ask questions, right? That's what privates do. They ask questions of generals. Actually, I don't think they're supposed to do that, but that's what this one does. The problem that we have, and the problem that my story goes into and how it ties in with everything that you've seen in the last few years, is because when I came back and I didn't have a job and I went to work with Dynology, I ended up going back overseas and I worked on a contract. This was in 2007, so it's right about the time that we're starting to have the iPhone take off. Facebook was really starting to take off at that point, although it wasn't allowed on government networks. It was becoming very big at the time, 2007, 2008, 9, and 10. So what I was tasked with was converting the Force Psychological Operations Group from dropping flyers from planes to a more social media psychological warfare capabilities. So this could be both overt capabilities, like overt being completely open, the Voice of America, things like that, right? They're government-owned propaganda, right? So we help only not wrong government, but so we have these things, and they're good, right? They help explain to other countries and other nations what our freedoms are and what our beliefs are, and there's nothing wrong with that. It can be a very powerful tool. But we also helped make the capability, at least, right? So I'm not going to go into anything that we may or may not have done with this capability. But the capability that we built also had to be capable of navigating the dark web, navigating terrorist websites, right? So you got terrorists that have administrators, right? When you think of like terrorist websites, don't think of a cave, right? This is an example, the Syrian Electronic Army. Most cybersecurity guys, and I've got almost 20 years in cybersecurity, right? So I'm almost 20 years in IT security, network security, and such like that. So this is sort of a wheelhouse of mine. And you can't just assume that, well, these guys are just like terrorists and stuff. They're living in caves, and that they're not, right? They have the Syrian Electronic Army. Actually, most serious IT people pegged them for the Sony hack back a few years back, right? So they were a very well organized, well trained, very powerful organization, right? And they a huge amount of the stolen data, stolen credit cards, dark web action, some of the viruses that you've seen a few years ago. Remember a few years ago when viruses were locking up hospitals and freezing up all their files, and if you paid them X amount of money, it might unfreeze it. Some of those things are really, when I see that, those are the first things I look for, like the Syrian Electronic Army, then, maybe North Korea, China, Russia, right? Russia is a country that on a day that ends in Y will be trying to hack something. One of the original networks, one of the original hacking networks was called the RBN, the Russian Business Network. Sounds extremely innocuous, but the RBN was actually one of the first main dark web type environments that at one time launched 90% of all viruses in the world, right? But this isn't a government-run thing. It's not like Putin sitting back there releasing viruses. These are just criminals that are, doing what criminals do. So you don't want to treat them like a state. You don't want to treat them like a child either, because they can do a lot of damage. So we have to be able to navigate these. We have to be able to go in there. We have to be able to sometimes appear as though we are not who we are. You have to be able to appear. If you look like you're coming from Virginia on a licensed Windows 10 computer and you're trying to, infiltrate a terrorist organization in Afghanistan, chances are that administrator of that site's going to go, this guy's, he's not one of us, and you're going to lose it. So we had to be able to provide that capability to be able to navigate being anyone you wanted to be, looking like you were anywhere in the world. I could literally make it look like I was sending an email from the Kremlin. There is not one single, there wasn't at the time, all the way up to 2010, I guarantee you now, they still couldn't. There wasn't one single government agency, federal agency, CIA, NSA, and I even tested it against a lot of these guys, right? That could literally tell that it was me sending it from the beach in Clearwater, sending an email from the Kremlin, right? So when I saw what was happening, transpiring in 2016, just before the election, and we started getting into the Russia, and the DNC, after the DNC emails were hacked. Within just a few days of that, of the incident with the DNC emails, we had several intelligence agencies coming out saying, "Oh, we've tracked it down. It's the Russians." And I'm like, well, the Russians are probably, I wouldn't say as good as me, but they're really good, right? So they're not going to leave breadcrumbs going right back to Russia. I would leave breadcrumbs going to Russia if I didn't want to look like it was coming from me, right? So I leave things to throw you off the track. I use proxies. I use VPN. There's just so many ways that I can make it that at best maybe a couple years. If you found it's really impossible, right? So when they come out after 3 days and say, "Oh, the Russians did this," I said, well, it wasn't the Russians. We can rule them out because